The Defeat of the West is a historical political book written by the French historian Emmanuel Todd in 2024. The book traces the historical factors of the decline of religion in the West and the consequences that flow from it to explain the failures of the foreign policies of the United States and Europe, emphasizing the case of the war in Ukraine. Todd starts his book with a chapter about the Russian stability, in which he highlights the underestimation of Russia by the West. According to the author, there is a Western representation conveyed that Russia is a bankrupt country, while statistics linked, for example, to the suicide rate and deaths from alcoholism show that it is a stable country. Todd evokes Russian sovereignty in several areas of society. For instance, he shows how Russia has achieved food self-sufficiency by becoming in 2020 one of the largest exporters of agricultural products in the world. He also explains how Russia adapted to sanctions as early as 2014 by making a series of economic reconversions which led to regain its autonomy from the Western market. For Todd, what allowed Russia to preserve its sovereignty in globalization was its prevention of the development of individualism and its protection of community values like patriotism. In the second chapter, The Ukrainian Enigma, Todd stresses that Ukraine's resistance to the Russian offensive has come as a surprise due to its failed state, which is unable to find a balance between keeping part of its population that immigrates to Russia or Western Europe and finding a solution to its decline in fertility. For Todd, there are three Ukraine: ultranationalist Ukraine, a Western and rural zone characterized by nuclear family and structured by Greek Catholic religious traditions. Its traditional home is around Lviv. Anarchic Ukraine around Kiev. It is vague. Its religious is Orthodox. It is characterized by nuclear family with weak patrilineal kinship. It is individualist and has never succeeded in creating a state. Anomic Ukraine, it includes the south and the east. It is Russophile. The middle classes have left it, and it has no longer a form, even if it is nuclear and patrilineal. Todd shows that in 2014, the world witnessed the true birth of the Ukrainian nation through the alliance of the ultranationalism of the West and the anarcho-militarism of the center against the Russophile part of the country, very weakened by the escape of its elites. In Chapter 3, In Eastern Europe, a postmodern Russophobia, Todd looks back on the economic history of Western Europe that was developed since the Middle Ages. This development impacted the evolution of Eastern Europe, whose economy was based on exporting simple products such as grains and wood. The Black Death of 13,048 accentuated the gap between these two Europes. Todd writes, in the West, the demographic collapse put the peasantry in a position of strength and led to the liquidation of serfdom. In the East, which was under-urbanized and as a result less affected by the pandemic, the hold of the landowners was threatened and what Engels called the second serfdom emerged. In Chapter 4, What is the West?, Todd explains that the crisis of the West is linked to its industrial deficiencies and family structures. He defines the West first as large countries such as England, the United States, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan, and as liberal and democratic revolution, where England, the United States, and France, with their history, found a narrow liberal West. As a result, the West is not just liberal given the movements of fascism, Nazism, and militancy that it has known. This West is also characterized by two major cultural revolutions, the Italian Renaissance and German Protestantism. Protestantism is therefore doubly at the heart of the history of the West, for the better with educational and then economic growth, and for the worse with the idea that men are unequal. It was also the first driving force behind the development of nation-states. The author also analyzes how liberal democracies become liberal oligarchies. He explains this phenomenon by a dysfunction of the majority representation and a protection of the rich minority that represents 1% of the population. As a result, the struggle of the liberal democracies of the West against the Russian autocracy becomes a clash between the liberal oligarchies of the West and the Russian authoritarian democracy. Chapter 5 is titled The Assisted Suicide of Europe, in which Todd criticizes the discourse and politics against Russia. He emphasizes that the sanctions against Russia have caused the opposite effect, an explosion of inflation in the European continent. He writes, "The trade balance of the Eurozone went from a positive value of 116 billion in 2021 to a negative value of 400 billion in 2022. The Russian threat is a fantasy, according to the author, because this country does not have the demographic and military means for expansion towards the West." He also mentions that the European upper classes have lost their autonomy in the face of surveillance by the NSA that holds information regarding European leaders. Chapter 6, In Britain, Towards Nation Zero, Todd details the question of Protestantism by stressing how it threatens the collective conscience and calls for literacy in order to have access to the scriptures. The retreat of Protestantism goes through several phases according to Todd. Going from active Protestantism to zombie Protestantism corresponds to the period between 1870 and 1930, where religion rusts but values persist in society. Protestantism Zero begins in the 60s with the development of higher education and the optimization of society. It is illustrated by phenomena like the fall of baptisms, the explosion of illegitimate unions and divorces, single-parent families, rise in cremations, and marriage for all. Chapter 7, Scandinavia, From Feminism to Warmongering, traces the transformation of countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Finland that take an interest in military. For Todd, Sweden and Finland's decision to join NATO is a sign of a need for belonging rather than the need of protection from Russia. Chapter 8 is titled The True Nature of America, Oligarchy and Nihilism. Here the author argues that the concept of nihilism is what explains how the United States went from a country that showed Europe the path to prosperity to a country of poverty and social automation. The first demonstration of this nihilism is the increase in the death rate from alcoholism, suicide, and opioid addiction. Zero Protestantism also affects the United States, as shown in the decline of fertility, the rise of homosexuality, marriage for all, and transgender. Chapter 9, Deflating the American Economy, reviews the decline of the U.S. industrial and agricultural production. Todd argues that the U.S. GDP does not reflect the real production of wealth in the United States, and it should be rather looked at the RDP. The industrial decline of the United States is linked to an internal social brain drain, that is to say, that students are moving more towards law, finance, business schools rather than engineering. To compensate for its effective collapse, the United States is massively importing STEM workers. In Chapter 10, The Washington Gang, the author emphasizes that the future of the ruling classes can be read in the universities. He puts forward statistics showing that whites still make up 61% of the American population, but represents only 46% of students in the Big Three, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. As for blacks, they are underrepresented, 13.3% in the American population and 10% in these universities. Latinos make up 20% of the population and 16% of the students. Todd also stresses the decline of the Jewish influence. He points out, for instance, that Harvard went from 25% Jewish in the 90s and 2000s to less than 10% today. This decline is also observed in political power and in Hollywood. Todd evokes the notion of a Washington village to emphasize a group of individuals not united by a national or universal belief. Finally, Chapter 11, Why the Rest of the World Chose Russia. Todd explains that American culture is narcissistic and the West think it is the center of the world while the BRICS continue to expand. The rest of the world wants Russia to win this war because it has turned out that globalization is only a recolonization of the world by the West, led by the United States. In the rest of the world, there are family structures that oppose those of the West. Russia is therefore observed as a country that lives off its own resources and work and has no interest in imposing its vision to the world. The economic sanctions against Russia did not work because the rest of the world did not participate. The rejection of homosexuality and the entire LGBT community in Russia is a soft power strategy that appeals to other countries in the world. This conservatism has made it possible to get closer to Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. The conclusion of this book is a prospective scenario. For Todd, Russia is not nationalist in the classical sense. It is a nation that is also inert. However, unlike the French, the Russians are certainly postmodern, but remain safe from nihilism. The American-Ukrainian defeat will allow Russia and Germany to collaborate because they will not be able to wage war due to their fertility rate of 1.5 children per woman. While the United States was waging wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, China was destroying its industry and Russia was recovering. Germany is doing well because it embodies anthropological, educational, and technological potential. The countries that were counting on the United States to protect them against Russia or China have lost 20% of their territory.